In the winter of 1995, Christmas in rural Tennessee wasn't a time of celebration. It was the moment a 30-year nightmare began along a lonely fence line. While the rest of the country was focused on the warmth of the season, a farmer in a remote corner of the county was making a routine check of his perimeter. It was a chore he had done 1,000 times before, but on this morning, the temperature had dropped low enough to crystallize the dew on the barbed wire, and something caught the light that didn't belong in the brush. Half buried in the mud and the frost was a discarded backpack. It was weathered, the fabric stiff from the elements, as if it had been waiting to be found for weeks. Local authorities arrived as the sun began to set, casting long, thin shadows across the valley. When they unzipped that bag, the contents didn't provide answers. Instead, they revealed a chilling reality. Inside were personal items, a set of keys, a half-eaten snack, and a small handwritten note, all belonging to a person who had vanished without a trace 14 days prior. But there was something else. Pressed into the bottom of the bag was a single, dark stain that the freezing rain hadn't been able to wash away. For the next 3 decades, that fence line would become a place of local legend and quiet fear. Investigators would return to that dirt year after year, sift through the same records, and interview the same tight-lipped neighbors. They looked for a struggle, they looked for a motive, but they found a wall of silence. The case was eventually boxed up. It moved from the active desk to the archive room, and finally to a dusty shelf in the basement of the precinct. To the world, the story was over. To the people of this town, the mystery was a permanent scar. But while the file sat in the dark, the world outside was changing. Technology was catching up to the secrets buried in that Tennessee mud. We often think that time helps a person escape their past. We assume that after 30 years, the trail is too cold to follow, and the memories are too faded to matter. But in the spring of 2025, a laboratory halfway across the country pulled a ghost out of that 30-year-old stain. What they found didn't just point to a stranger or a drifter passing through. It pointed to a front porch less than 3 miles from that fence line. It pointed to a man who had attended the vigils, a man who had shaken the hands of the victim's family, and a man who believed that 30 years of silence meant he was safe. This is the account of the evidence that refused to disappear, the genealogy that broke a 3-decade stalemate, and the arrest that finally forced a quiet community to look at one of its own. To understand the weight of what was lost, you have to look past the yellow police tape and the forensic reports. You have to look at the person who occupied the center of this story. In 1995, the person at the heart of this mystery was a 28-year-old local named Sarah Miller. In a town where everyone is defined by their work or their family, Sarah was defined by her presence. She wasn't a public figure or a high-ranking official. She was a woman whose life was woven into the very fabric of the community. She was a mother to a 4-year-old son, and she worked as a substitute teacher at the local elementary school. Neighbors remember her as the type of person who would leave a bag of garden vegetables on your porch without leaving a note. She was the one who remembered birthdays, the one who stayed late after church functions to help fold the chairs, and the one who always had a kind word for the people most others ignored. There are photographs of her from that final summer, grainy, saturated images of a woman with a quick smile, standing in front of a modest brick house with marigolds lining the walkway. She looked like the embodiment of the stability this town took for granted. But that stability is a fragile thing. We often believe that a person's character acts as a shield, that if you are kind enough, or involved enough, or loved enough, you are somehow protected from the randomness of the world. Sarah's life was built on that belief. She lived in a house that her father had helped build. She shopped at the same grocery store where she had worked as a teenager. Her world was small, intentional. and by all accounts, exceptionally safe. To her 4-year-old son, she was the entire world. To the students at the school, she was the teacher who didn't mind if you stayed inside during recess to finish a drawing. She was the daughter who called her parents every single evening at 7 o'clock. This was not a life marked by conflict or complication. It was a life of quiet, steady purpose. Then we come to the date of December 11th, 1995. It was a Monday, and in this part of Tennessee, the air had a sharp, metallic bite to it that suggested snow was on the way. Sarah's routine that morning was indistinguishable from 100 other Mondays. The logs in the police station show the weather was clear but cold, with the sun struggling to break through a thick layer of gray clouds. At 7:15 a.m., Sarah's alarm went off. She made breakfast for her son, oatmeal and toast, while the local radio played the morning farm report and the weather forecast. Those who spoke to her that morning say she sounded completely normal. She discussed her plans for the week, a Christmas pageant at the school, a grocery run for holiday baking supplies, and a plan to drop off a coat at the dye cleaners. At 8:30 a.m., she dropped her son off at her mother's house. This was the ritual: a quick hug, a promise to be back by 5, and a wave from the driveway. Her mother would later tell investigators that Sarah seemed energized. She was looking forward to the school day. There was no hesitation in her voice, no lingering glance in the rearview mirror. She arrived at the elementary school at 8:50 a.m. Throughout the day, she was seen by dozens of people. She was in the cafeteria at noon. She was in the teacher's lounge at 2:25 p.m., sharing a cup of coffee and talking about the upcoming winter break. Witnesses say she was her usual self, engaged, cheerful, and focused on her tasks. There was absolutely nothing in her behavior that suggested she was under any kind of pressure or that she was expecting a meeting with anyone outside of her normal circle. The final bell rang at 3:30 p.m. Sarah stayed behind for about 40 minutes to organize her classroom for the following day. She was seen walking to her car in the faculty parking lot at approximately 4:12 p.m. A fellow teacher waved to her. Sarah waved back as she unlocked the door of her tan sedan. This is where the routine begins to fracture. Usually, the drive from the school to her mother's house takes exactly 12 minutes. It's a straight shot down a 2-lane county road, bordered on both sides by dense woods and occasional stretches of pasture. It is a road Sarah had driven thousands of times. She knew every curve, every dip in the asphalt, and every house along the way. At 4:25 p.m., a local farmer driving a tractor saw a car matching Sarah's description turning onto the long, straight stretch of road that leads towards the valley. He noted nothing unusual. The car was traveling at the speed limit, the headlights were on because the afternoon light was already beginning to fade. But Sarah never arrived at her mother's house. At 5 p.m., her mother began to watch the clock. By 5:15 p.m., the concern started to settle in. In a life as disciplined and predictable as Sarah's, a 15-minute delay was a significant event. Her mother called Sarah's home phone, no answer. She called the school, no answer. By 6 p.m., the sun had vanished completely and the temperature had plummeted. The silence on the other end of the phone was no longer just an inconvenience, it was a signal. Somewhere between that faculty parking lot and her mother's front porch, a distance of less than 7 miles, Sarah Miller had encountered something that stripped away her routine and her future. The exact moment she was last seen with absolute certainty was 4:12 p.m., standing by her car, a teacher's bag slung over her shoulder, prepared for a quiet evening at home. Everything that happened after that moment remained a total vacuum of information for 30 years. By 8 o'clock that evening, the quiet of the county had been replaced by a frantic energy. It began with phone calls between family members, then shifted to neighbors, and finally to the sheriff's department. In a town of this size, a missing person report involving someone like Sarah Miller wasn't just a police matter, it was a community crisis. The initial search was massive and immediate. Within 6 hours of her disappearance, the local volunteer fire department had set up a staging area at the elementary school where Sarah was last seen. By the following morning, over 200 people had arrived to help. These weren't professional search and rescue teams. They were shop owners, farmers, and parents of the children Sarah taught. They moved through the woods in long horizontal lines, their shoulders touching, hoping to find a footprint, a scrap of clothing, or the tan sedan that seemed to have evaporated into the cold Tennessee air. The weather, however, was not an ally. A heavy frost had settled over the valley, followed by a light dusting of snow that threatened to cover any physical evidence left on the ground. Volunteers worked until their fingers were numb, fueled by thermoses of coffee and a desperate belief that Sarah was simply stuck somewhere, perhaps off the side of a road in a ditch where her car couldn't be seen. But as the days turned into a week, the mood shifted from hope to a heavy, quiet dread. The flyers began to appear on every telephone pole and storefront window, a high school graduation photo of Sarah, smiling, under the bold black letters, "Missing." The image became a permanent fixture of the landscape, the paper yellowing and the edges curling as the winter progressed. Early theories were abundant, but they led into dead ends. Investigators looked at the possibility of a random accident, but no tire tracks were found leaving the roadway. They looked into the idea of a voluntary disappearance, but that theory was dismissed almost immediately by everyone who knew her. A woman who had just prepared her classroom for the next day and left her 4-year-old son with her mother does not simply walk away from her life. Then, on the 14th day, the discovery of the backpack along that remote fence line changed the trajectory of the case. It confirmed that this was not a simple missing person case. It suggested that someone else had been involved. Yet, despite the discovery, the investigation began to stall. The forensic tools of 1995 were limited. The dark stain on the bag was tested, but without a suspect to match it against, it was just a biological fact with no name attached. As the months turned into years, the active status of the case began to fade. The search party stopped meeting. The fire department went back to their routine. The sheriff's office, faced with new cases and limited resources, moved Sarah's file into a cabinet. This is the period we call the cold years, a stretch of time where a case becomes part of the local lore, a story told in hushed tones at the diner, but no longer a priority for the state. For 30 years, Sarah's family lived in a state of suspended grief. They watched her son grow up without a mother, watched the school where she taught be renovated and eventually replaced, and watched as the people who might have seen something that day moved away or passed away. However, hidden within those original 1995 case files was a detail that would later haunt the investigators who inherited the case. During the second week of the original investigation, a statement was taken from a local man who lived on the periphery of the search area. He had reported seeing a dark-colored truck parked on the shoulder of the road not far from the fence line on the afternoon Sarah vanished. He noted that the hood was up, as if the driver was experiencing mechanical trouble. He even provided a partial description of the driver, a man in a work jacket, appearing to be in his late 20s or early 30s. At the time, this lead was recorded, but it was never pursued with vigor. The reason was a matter of unfortunate timing and administrative oversight. On the day that lead came in, the department was overwhelmed by a separate high-profile incident in the next town over. The statement was filed into a secondary folder intended for follow-up the following week, but the following week brought the discovery of the backpack, and the focus shifted entirely to the forensic evidence of the bag. The man in the dark truck was forgotten. He was never interviewed. His vehicle was never checked. In the world of cold cases, these are known as the gaps. They are the moments where the truth is presented to the authorities, but because of the chaos of a live investigation, the information is filed away instead of acted upon. For 30 years, that statement sat in a manila envelope, buried under hundreds of pages of less relevant information. It was a lead that could have changed the outcome in 1995. Instead, it became a silent witness to the passage of time, waiting for a new generation of investigators to realize that the answer had been in the building all along. The man who owned that truck didn't flee, he didn't hide. He stayed in the county, watched the news, and lived his life, perhaps believing that the oversight of 1995 had granted him a permanent pass. He didn't know that the cold years were about to come to a very sudden and very public end. For 30 years, the case was defined by what was missing witnesses, missing leads, and a missing resolution. But as we entered the year 2025, the investigation entered a landscape that the original detectives of 1995 could never have imagined. The bridge between the past and the present was a single microscopic sample. That dark stain on the bottom of Sarah's backpack had been preserved in a climate-controlled evidence locker for 30 years. In 1995, it was a dead end. In 2025, it became a biological roadmap. This brings us to the science of forensic genealogy, a process that has fundamentally changed the nature of cold case investigations. To understand how this works, you have to think of DNA not just as a code for an individual, but as a family tree written in chemistry. Every person carries markers passed down from their ancestors, and in the decades since Sarah vanished, millions of people across the globe have voluntarily uploaded their genetic profiles to public databases to learn about their heritage. In early 2025, the state's cold case unit submitted the profile from the backpack to one of these specialized databases. They weren't looking for a direct match, they were looking for a genetic cousin. They found several. These were individuals who had never been to Tennessee, people who had no connection to the crime, but who shared a significant amount of DNA from the unidentified contributor from the fence line. By working backward through public records, birth certificates, and obituaries, a team of genetic genealogists began to build a massive, sprawling tree. They identified a common set of great-grandparents located in a neighboring state. From there, they began to filter the branches. They looked for male descendants who would have been the right age in 1995. They looked for individuals who had a reason to be in that specific Tennessee valley on a Monday afternoon in December. The tree eventually narrowed down to a single branch, and on that branch was a name that made the investigators in the room go silent. It was the name of a man who lived less than 3 miles from the school where Sarah Miller was last seen. With a name in hand, the investigation was no longer cold, it was suddenly intensely active. This led to the detective work of the modern era, a phase of the case that required a level of precision and patience that modern technology facilitates. The goal was no longer just to find a name, but to confirm it without the suspect ever knowing he was under a microscope. Beginning in the spring of 2025, a specialized surveillance team was moved into the county. They operated in the shadows, using vehicles that blended into the rural landscape, unmarked trucks, utility vans, and local sedans. They watched the suspect's home from a distance, documenting his movements, his routines, and his interactions. They observed a man who appeared to be a pillar of his neighborhood. He was a man in his late 50s now, someone who worked a steady job, mowed his lawn on Saturday mornings, and attended local community events. To the outside world, he was a person of total regularity. But the detectives were looking for something specific. They were waiting for a moment to bridge the gap between his current life and the evidence from 1995. The surveillance was meticulous. They tracked his path to work. They noted where he stopped for coffee. They watched as he threw out his household trash. In the modern era of policing, the objective is to recover a discarded sample, something the suspect has touched and thrown away, which then becomes public property. For weeks, the team waited. They saw him discard a coffee cup at a gas station, but the wind blew it into a heavy traffic lane, making it impossible to recover safely. They saw him leave a water bottle at a park, but a bystander picked it up and threw it into a crushed bin before the team could move in. The tension within the unit was significant, but it was a quiet, professional tension. They knew that after 30 years, they couldn't afford a single procedural error. Finally, in a local diner, the kind of place where Sarah Miller might have eaten years before, the suspect finished a meal and left behind a crumpled napkin and a plastic straw. The surveillance team, sitting at a booth nearby, waited until he had cleared the parking lot before moving in. Those items were bagged, sealed, and rushed to the state laboratory under a high-priority escort. 48 hours later, the results came back. The DNA from the straw was a 100% match to the DNA found on the backpack in 1995. The genetic cousin lead had been correct. The overlooked detail of the dark truck from the original file now had a driver, a name, and a definitive link to the crime scene. The detectives didn't move immediately. They spent the next several days building a digital reconstruction of the suspect's life in 1995. They tracked down his employment records from that year and confirmed he had been working a route that took him directly past the elementary school at 4:15 p.m. They found old registration records for a dark-colored truck he had owned and subsequently sold 3 months after the disappearance. The shadow of the past was finally catching up to the present. The man who had spent 30 decades believing he had successfully blended into the background now was the center of a coordinated, multi-agency operation. The quiet surveillance was over. The time for the community to be confronted with the truth had arrived. By the morning of the arrest, the tactical plan had been refined down to the second. There was no need for sirens or a high-speed chase. The objective was to maintain the quiet of the neighborhood until the very last moment, ensuring that the transition from a 30-year secret to a public accounting was handled with absolute control. The moment of impact occurred at 7:42 a.m. on a Tuesday. The suspect was following a routine he had maintained for years. He had just stepped out of his front door, a thermos in one hand and his truck keys in the other. He was wearing a tan work jacket, similar to the one described in a deprioritized police report 30 years earlier. He took 3 steps toward his vehicle before the quiet of his suburban street was broken. 4 unmarked SUVs moved into position, blocking the ends of his driveway. The officers who stepped out were not the local patrolmen he saw at the coffee shop. These were state investigators and federal agents, men and women who had spent months living with the ghost of Sarah Miller. They moved with a purpose that required no explanation. Witnesses, neighbors who were just beginning their own morning routines, described the scene as being handled with a chilling efficiency. There was no shouting, no struggle. The suspect simply stopped. He looked at the officers, then down to the gravel, and then back at his own front door. It was as if a weight he had been carrying since 1995 had finally become too heavy to hold. As the handcuffs were secured, the silence of the neighborhood returned, but the reality of the town had been altered forever. By noon, the news had begun to spread, and the phrase "arrest shocks community" was no longer just a headline. It was the only topic of conversation in every home, diner, and place of worship in the county. The true impact, however, came when the suspect's identity was finally released. This was not a drifter. This was not a man with a long history of public disturbances. The man arrested for the events of 1995 was William Bill Henderson. Bill Henderson was a name known to almost everyone in the valley. He was a retired long-haul driver who had spent the last decade working as a part-time maintenance man for the local parks department. He was the man you called when your fence needed mending or when a fallen tree blocked the road after a storm. He was a regular at the high school football games, a man who always sat in the same seat on the bleachers and cheered for the local team. But the reveal went deeper than just a familiar face. As investigators began to speak with Sarah Miller's extended family, a devastating connection emerged. Bill Henderson attended the same church as Sarah's parents. In the weeks following her disappearance in 1995, he had been one of the people who brought over casseroles. He had sat in their living room, bowed his head in prayer, and listened as they wept over the lack of leads. He had even participated in the second wave of searches, walking the very woods where the evidence he knew lay buried. He occupied a space in the community that allowed him to monitor the investigation from the inside. He knew what the police were saying because he stood in the crowds at the town hall meetings. He knew the family was suffering because he looked them in the eye and offered his condolences. For 30 years, the town had looked for a monster in the shadows. They had imagined a shadowy figure coming from the outside to disrupt their peace. They never suspected that the answer was a man who helped them clear snow from their driveways. The profile that emerged was one of a man who relied on his own unremarkable nature. He believed that if he remained helpful, stayed quiet, and never left the area, he would never be considered a suspect. He used the community's trust as a shield. He watched Sarah's son grow from a child into a man, passing him in the grocery store aisles for years, never showing a hint of the truth. This was the peak of the emotional weight for the residents of the county. The realization that the person responsible for 30 years of collective trauma had been a participant in their daily lives created a sense of profound disorientation. It forced everyone to look back at 30 decades of interactions, every handshake, every casual conversation at the post office, and see them in a completely different light. The arrest of Bill Henderson didn't just solve a crime, it dismantled a 30-year deception. It proved that the most significant secrets are often held by those who appear to have nothing to hide. The fence line mystery was no longer a mystery, but the process of understanding how a neighbor could live a double life for 30 years was only just beginning. The legal proceedings that followed the arrest of Bill Henderson were marked by a lack of the usual courtroom theatrics. When faced with the undeniable reality of the genetic evidence and the recovered documentation of his own past, the man who had remained silent for 30 years finally chose to speak. In a small county courthouse, under the watchful eyes of 3 generations of the Miller family, the details of that December afternoon in 1995 were officially entered into the record. Henderson admitted to the events along the fence line, describing a sequence of actions that lacked any clear motive other than a momentary and catastrophic choice. He spoke in a flat, monotone voice, providing the missing pieces of a puzzle that had haunted the region since the mid-90s. The sentencing was a moment of profound gravity. The judge, a man who had been a young lawyer when the case first broke, handed down a term of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. In his closing remarks, he noted that while the law could provide a container for justice, it could never fully restore the decades of peace that had been stripped from the community. For Sarah Miller's family, the reaction was not one of celebration, but of a quiet, exhausted relief. Her son, now 34 years old, older than his mother was when she vanished, issued a statement on the courthouse steps. He did not speak of vengeance. He spoke of the marigolds his mother used to plant. He spoke of the fact that he could finally look at a photograph of her and know that the story had an ending. A permanent memorial now stands near the site where the backpack was found in 1995. It is a simple stone plinth surrounded by a small garden that is maintained by the same students Sarah once taught. It serves as a reminder that even in the most isolated corners of the world, a life lived with kindness is never truly forgotten, and the truth has a way of outlasting those who try to bury it. As we look back on the 30-year journey of the Tennessee fence line case, we are forced to confront a difficult reality about the world we live in. We tend to view the places we live as transparent and known. We trust our routines, we trust our neighbors, and we trust that the people we see every day are exactly who they claim to be. But this case proves that the passage of time is not a guarantee of safety. It proves that the answers to our most haunting questions are often much closer than we care to imagine. Bill Henderson didn't exist in a vacuum. He existed in the heart of a community, participating in the same rituals and sharing the same air as the people he had wronged. It leads us to a question that is as uncomfortable as it is necessary. How many more neighbors are currently living among us, holding on to secrets that are 10, 20, or 30 years old? Across the country, there are thousands of boxes sitting on precinct shelves, filled with similar manila envelopes and unidentified biological samples. Every one of those boxes represents a person like Sarah Miller, a life of purpose that was interrupted, and a family that is still waiting for the clock to start moving again. The breakthrough in 2025 has shown us that no case is ever truly beyond the reach of the truth, but it requires a collective refusal to let these stories fade into the background. It requires us to keep looking, keep asking, and keep demanding that the gaps in the records be closed. If you found this investigation meaningful, I invite you to join our community here at Cold Case Reviews. By subscribing, you help ensure that these accounts remain in the public eye. I want to hear from you in the comments below. Is there a case in your own area? Perhaps a story from your own childhood or a local mystery that has never been resolved that you believe deserves a second look? Tell me your theories and the details you think have been overlooked. The more we discuss these cases, the harder it becomes for the truth to stay hidden. The fence line in Tennessee is no longer a place of mystery. It is a place of history. But there are many more lines yet to be drawn. Thank you for walking through this account with me. Until the next case is reviewed,